So can you weld aluminum with an inexpensive MIG without buying an expensive spool gun? The answer is yes, and I'll show you exactly how I set it up. The first thing that you want to do is replace your actual MIG wire with aluminum wire. This is 4043, which is a soft wire. It burns quickly. 5356 I've used also. It's a little stiffer. Here are the advantages to both. 5356 runs through your cable feed without the use of a spool gun a little better because it's naturally a stiffer wire. It also makes more black smoke, it leaves a black residue on the weld. I think it's because of magnesium. There's something in it that makes it stiffer that creates a little more of the black residue. However, it does seem to come off with a stainless steel wire brush. 4043 does pull a little better. It lays down a little smoother and a little better without the black residue. I'm using 4043 on this video because that's what my welding store had whenever I went to buy wire. The other thing that you want to do is you want to use an oversized tip. I'm welding with 30 thousandths and 35 thousandths both, but I'm using a 45 thousandths MIG tip. What happens whenever you begin to weld aluminum is the wire expands. Aluminum wire expands more adversely than your normal MIG wire. So you need an oversized tip to allow that to expand without creating a blockage in the gun. The primary issue in trying to weld aluminum with any kind of MIG, whether it's a cheap MIG or an expensive MIG, is the wire feed. It'll often ball up inside the feed system because it's unable to push it through the feed tube. A lot of times that's actually not because of the feed tube, but it's because as the wire expands, it gets caught in the tip. So an oversized tip, definitely your best friend as you're MIG welding aluminum. The other thing that you want to do is when you're welding, make sure that your feed tube, your lead, is as straight as possible. I've noticed, especially with 4043, the straighter I keep this, and sometimes I'll even pull it tight. If you have this on a cart, it would honestly be a lot better. Set your welder as far away as you can from your workspace, especially if you're welding something small on a welding table. It works really well. There are a few stipulations and some things that you couldn't do with this, but you can weld aluminum. So the straighter this is, the better, the less resistance throughout the tube, and the better your wire feed. The other thing that you have to do whenever you're welding aluminum with a MIG, and this is the same with a spool gun or a TIG welder, is you have to use 100% argon gas. So you have to trade that out. It's not a 75 or even a 90% argon. It has to be 100% argon. Leave the settings on your welder basically the same as you would if you're using shielding gas on steel. So you don't have to reverse the polarity. If you've been welding with flux core wire, you'll have to change the polarity inside your welder, and that's back here by the wire feed on almost every welder. You'll have to change it back just the way you would if you're MIG welding steel. So the polarity stays the same. The other thing that you'll have to do, because aluminum is such a good conductor, that heat will run from your welding area very quickly. This whole piece of metal will heat up really quick as I start to weld it, which is very different than steel, which means it takes a lot more heat. Aluminum may be softer than steel, but it requires a significantly higher heat setting to weld the aluminum. So on this particular welder, on the Chicago Electric cheap, this was a Harbor Freight $190 welder. It is a 220. I haven't tried to weld with a 110. My guess is that a 110 probably would not do it, but a 220 will. And I set my heat to max, and I turn my wire feed all the way up. It takes a lot of wire. You're going to burn a lot of wire when you're welding aluminum. And so I turn the wire feed almost all the way up. I'll adjust it back down a little bit if necessary, but I've been running everything highest wire speed possible and highest heat setting possible. And this, I've been able to weld 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch both with aluminum. So let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so after the welder's set up, I've connected the argon shielding gas, 100% pure argon. I turn the cubic feet up to about 30. It takes quite a bit of shielding gas, so I turn that up to about 30, and it seems to shield adequately. So the first thing you want to do with your aluminum is you want to prepare the aluminum for welding with a stainless steel wire brush. I have a wire wheel on my grinder that works exceptionally well. You want to make sure that anything that's laying on the surface of this is removed. Do not use a stainless steel brush if it's been used on steel. If it's been used on steel, it's only going to be good for steel. It's going to introduce impurities back into the metal that you're trying to clean. I've used solvents, etc., to clean the aluminum, but honestly, they don't seem to be necessary. I've had just as good luck with just cleaning with a stainless steel wire brush. So once the metal is cleaned and ready to weld, we pull that welding lead fairly tight. It's barely even laying on my welding table. The welder's lined up straight with where I'm at to reduce any friction inside the welding tube, and you can tell I'm just using with the 6-foot lead that came with the Chicago welder. And then it's pretty much like any other type of welding. If you've never welded aluminum before, it's going to pull different. You may find that you need to move your nozzle a little bit more to get both of the areas heated up well. Heat is your friend. If you're having trouble getting the weld to start well, you may even want to take a small propane torch and preheat your metal. That can also help get the beginning of your weld to flow as well as the end of the weld. And you'll notice that your puddle is going to change as you weld. So it may be tall and the heat may not be dispersing into both parts of the metal as you begin. And by the end of your weld, you're going to have to change the pace at which you weld to keep the weld looking the same, as you move from beginning to end, especially on a longer weld. On this weld, the short weld, there's a slight difference in the way it'll puddle and the way it'll flow from the beginning of the weld to the end of the weld. I've also found that pushing the puddle works better. So I'll run at about a 15-degree angle and then I'll weld forward. And primarily that keeps the heat out in front, which is good. It also keeps the shielding gas out in front to prevent contamination. So let's do a simple weld here and see how it turns out. Okay. So here's the bead. It's not the most beautiful. There's still a little black film. Let me see if you can get to where you can see that. There's still a little black film around the weld, but so far I've been able to simply brush that away with the wire brush, just about that quick. And the strength of the weld, the integrity of the weld seems to be fine. That's not the most beautiful weld. It's certainly not as perfect as TIG welding, but if you don't have a $2,000 TIG welder and you happen to have a very inexpensive, well, this is about the cheapest wire weld, 220 wire welder that I've found, and it does weld aluminum if you set it up right. So good luck on your projects. I'm not a professional. I know that there's probably a lot of user error in the appearance of that weld. This is not intended to be a tutorial on how to weld aluminum professionally or extremely well, but it was intended to prove that you can weld aluminum with an inexpensive welder like the Chicago Electric.